Welcome to everyone. This is Hydrogen Economics, Do the Dollars Make Sense? And I'm Tracy Carluccio, Deputy Director of Delaware Riverkeeper Network. Thank you all for joining this evening. Tonight, we're looking forward to hearing from hydrogen economics experts David Schlissel and also Anika Juhn. They both will be introduced in a minute now, and I'm handing it over to Anika Van Rossum, Advocacy and Policy Coordinator for Delaware Riverkeeper Network, who will introduce our speakers.
Hi, everyone. I'm Anika Van Rossum with Delaware Riverkeeper Network. So I just want to introduce our speakers. Before I do that, I just want to let you know, so we'll be hearing from David and Anika. And then after that, we'll be giving you a quick Mach 2 update. Then we'll go into Q&A, and then we'll talk about ways you can get involved. So to give you some intros on our speakers, so David Schlissel is in the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, or IEEFA's Director of Resource Planning Analysis, and is a hydrogen economy specialist. Dr. Schlissel has 50 years of experience as an economic and technical consultant on energy and environmental issues, has testified as an expert witness before regulatory commissions in more than 35 states and before the U.S. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. He has engineering degrees from MIT and Stanford University, as well as a Juris Doctor from Stanford Law School. He also has studied nuclear engineering at MIT in a non-degree program, and he has written and spoken extensively on the issues of blue hydrogen and carbon capture sequestration. His work with IEEFA on these and other issues can be found at IEEFA.org/people/David-Schlissel, and I will put that in the chat. And then also to introduce Anika Juhn. Anika Juhn is an energy data analyst at the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis with expertise in data analysis, spatial data analysis, and cartography. Currently, her research at IEEFA is focused on fossil hydrogen production and issues surrounding hydrogen and carbon capture and storage. Before joining IEEFA, she worked at the Census Bureau, creating complex maps and graphics to tell stories of changing population distribution in America. She holds a master's in geography from the University of Oregon and a bachelor's in environmental science from Northern Arizona University. So with that, I will turn it over.
Okay, guess it's to me. I will correct one thing Anika said. I am not a Dr. Schlissel. The only Dr. Schlissel that I know of, and I'm proud to say it, is my younger daughter. Hi, everyone. We're going to be talking about blue hydrogen tonight, but I just want to let you know if you have questions about green hydrogen, we'll try to answer them during the question and answer period. Next slide, please. We have written a report issued last September called Blue Hydrogen, not clean, not low carbon, not a solution. My part of the presentation will focus on the results of that analysis. Next slide, please. The US standard defines clean hydrogen as having a carbon intensity of less than or equal to 4 kilograms of CO2e emitted per kilogram of hydrogen produced. The federal government uses a model called GREET, greenhouse gas, regulated emissions, energy used for technologies, or something close to that for GREET. We have looked at the model extensively and found 4 key assumptions that cause the model to underestimate the carbon intensity of blue hydrogen, meaning it's dirtier than the federal government would have you believe. Next slide, please. The first flawed assumption is that the GREET model uses only 100-year global warming potentials instead of the higher and more appropriate 20-year GWPs. The climate crisis is upon us today. There's no reason to look at the impact of greenhouse gas emissions 100 years down the road. which minimizes their impact when compared to their using the shorter GWP life. Next slide, please. The second flawed assumption is that the model and the Department of Energy only assume that upstream methane emissions between the well where the methane / natural gas is produced and the hydrogen production facility is a very low 0.9%. If you read our study, you'll see that there are many scientific and academic studies that overall show that the average upstream methane leak is a higher 2.5 to 2.6%. Next slide, please. The third flawed assumption is that the GREET model and the Department of Energy assume that nearly all of the CO2 produced at a blue hydrogen production facility would be captured. So therefore, only a small amount would be emitted. That's overly optimistic, to say the least. As I'll show later, no operating carbon capture facility has come close to capturing 92 or 95% of the CO2 that it produces. Next slide, please. And finally, the last flawed assumption is it only looks at part of the lifetime. It's only a partial life cycle analysis, even though you'd think it would cover the whole lifetime, what's called from cradle to grave, from the production of the methane, natural gas, to the use of the hydrogen. That's not true. Congress has mandated that it only look at the portion of the lifetime, the portion of the emissions from the production of the natural gas through the back gate of the hydrogen production facility. Next slide, please. What this means is that if you use more realistic assumptions, you can see that the carbon intensity of blue hydrogen is far higher than the federal government would have you believe. With more realistic assumptions, even including higher CO2 capture rate, you can see on the left there that making blue hydrogen using what's called ATR, autothermal reforming, is above the federal clean hydrogen standard and should not be given any subsidy. The alternative technology, the one that's currently used today, SMR, is steam methane reforming, is slightly cleaner than the federal standard, but is still only eligible for the smallest federal subsidy. Next slide, please. Oh, I should mention, I apologize for this. I should have started by saying blue hydrogen is hydrogen made from methane or natural gas. Methane is the largest constituent of natural gas. Now, carbon capture is the key to blue hydrogen's financial viability, because without carbon capture, if you go, Peter, could you go back a slide? You can see that if you don't assume that nearly all of the CO2 produced during the production of hydrogen is captured, there is no blue hydrogen. It's not clean. Next slide, and then we'll jump to the next slide, please. There are roughly 30 operating carbon capture facilities around the world. We have tried to look at the actual CO2 capture rates at all of them. There's no information available for roughly half of them, half of these 30 facilities. Some are very new. but there's no information available for the 28 that were in operation, all of the 28 that were in operation through the end of 2022. You can see here for the facilities we were able to find, there's no facility has achieved the 95% or higher capture rate that's claimed by industry for hydrogen production facilities. In the middle, you'll see, and I guess you'd call that light brown, there are 3 operating hydrogen production facilities. None of them have come close to capturing 95% or higher of the CO2 they produce. And now I'll turn it over to my colleague, Anika.
Next slide, please. Thanks, David. So the hype around hydrogen means that there's a lot of money out there. And in addition to these 3 programs that I'll be talking about that are shown on this slide, there are others that do things like help offset construction costs or fund demonstration projects. And there might also be tax breaks and other incentives offered through state and local governments. But I'm just going to be talking about these 3 specifically. So first, there's that $7 billion in Hydrogen Hub project funding that was announced last fall. And this funding is in the form of DOE grants that are issued to applicants after certain milestones and other criteria are met. And while it may look like easy money, there's a really important time factor that industry must consider when they choose to participate in this program. If it takes too long to go through the DOE process, they may lose other investors or may not get their product to market first. So there is a financial risk to them. There are other federal loan funds available to blue hydrogen projects that are not accessed via the HUB program. These loans have a lot of requirements too, but the project would not need to be integrated into a hub in order to proceed. And then there are these tax credits. The first, 45V, is a credit that's awarded based on the amount of hydrogen that is produced. And the value of the credit increases according to a schedule of how clean the hydrogen is. There's no credit issued under 45V for hydrogen that has a life cycle carbon intensity above the clean hydrogen standard of 4 kilograms CO2e per kilogram hydrogen that David was discussing earlier. The draft 45V rules were released late last December by the Department of Treasury, and they outline the methods by which the credit will be calculated. Most of the rules pertain to green hydrogen, ensuring the energy used for electrolysis will not be pulled from the grid and effectively result in more fossil energy coming online to meet that increased demand. The rules are really important and help to ensure this commitment to hydrogen really will result in lower emissions. But they also mean that green hydrogen projects will need to have a dedicated renewable power source, which may be a hurdle that some proposed hub projects might not be able to meet in the given time frame. And those projects may need to shift gears, and there's a possibility that projects change from green hydrogen, meaning based on renewables, to blue, based on natural gas or methane. But we just don't know enough about any of the proposed projects in this hub to be able to understand the risks of that actually happening. There are also portions of the 45V rules that relate to blue hydrogen. The current version of the rules indicates that the amount of credit is calculated using a special version of the GREET model that David was talking about, in which the producer would enter information about the hydrogen produced at their facility. But all upstream parameters that could vary substantially between regions are fixed, including the methane emissions rates and the emissions profile of the electricity mix. As David discussed, these parameters have a huge impact on the final carbon intensity calculations, and by fixing them, 45V is really focused on emissions at the plant alone. And the final rules may be different, but this is the case for the draft version. And using the favorable assumptions in the GREET model, some blue hydrogen projects could qualify for 45V credits, but it would require that those very high sustained carbon capture rates over the course of a year, which haven't been demonstrated in commercial scale projects, actually occur. Now, moving on to 45Q, which targets carbon capture, it's a little bit of a different story. By capturing CO2, producers can access large subsidies while producing hydrogen that may be cleaner than unabated gray hydrogen, but exceeds the clean standard by several times. 45Q is a credit that can also be a direct pay credit for the first 5 years if a tax liability is below zero. Transferability of the credit could also make it easier for companies to finance their projects. Currently, companies will be able to benefit from 45Q for credits for 12 years. It's important to note that hydrogen production facilities cannot benefit from both 45V and 45Q. Next slide, please. This chart compares the size of 45Q and 45V credits, depending on the carbon intensity of the hydrogen produced. The horizontal axis shows carbon intensity with the clean hydrogen standard of 4 kilograms CO2e per kilogram hydrogen or less, shown in the green box. And the vertical axis shows the credit value in terms of dollars per kilogram hydrogen that's actually produced. Under 45V, clean hydrogen projects could qualify for various tiers of credits, as shown by the stepped green lines. The orange line shows the estimated credit value per kilogram blue hydrogen produced, and the value of the credits fall as the carbon intensity increases. So the dirtier it is, the less credit a facility would get. Blue hydrogen projects would not qualify under 45V unless they achieve those very high sustained carbon capture rates. And at those capture rates, interestingly, they would actually do better going for the 45Q credits and not 45V at all. But even when CO2 capture rates are much lower than promised, and the hydrogen is far dirtier than the clean standard, the return for capturing CO2 is actually comparable on a per kilogram hydrogen basis to projects that are meeting or exceeding the standard. So we're getting ready to pay for dirty hydrogen, and the capture rates could be as low as 70% at the production facility, and blue hydrogen would receive credits under 45Q that are comparable to producing clean hydrogen with a carbon intensity between 2.5 and 4. But instead, this blue hydrogen would have a carbon intensity of 6, which is much less than unabated gray hydrogen, but it certainly doesn't meet the definition of clean. Whereas the 45V credit does not apply if carbon intensity is above 4, 45Q could apply even as carbon intensities reach into double digits. And since a facility cannot benefit from both 45Q and 45V, ultimately there's no incentive for methane-based hydrogen production to even reach for those sky-high carbon capture rates that would result in hydrogen that meets the clean standard and qualifies for 45V. Next slide. A further alarming issue is that the 45Q provisions represent even more of a financial opportunity for hydrogen produced from coal gasification. It's a very emissions-intensive process that results in more air and water pollution than methane-based pathways. At just 45% carbon capture at the facility, the carbon intensity is 3 times the clean standard, but the project could harvest a credit per kilogram hydrogen as large as it would if it was actually clean. So next slide. How much money is this in the real world? Looking at an actual project can help bring some of these numbers into perspective. The Air Products facility in Louisiana plans to produce 750 million standard cubic feet of hydrogen per day. And assuming a 90% capacity factor, this amounts to about 585,000 metric tons of hydrogen per year. Air Products plans to capture 5 million tons of CO2 annually at the plant. Calculations of the carbon intensity of the operation using GREET default values indicate that it would be about 4.8. So none of the hydrogen produced would qualify for the 45V credit. But under 45Q, the 5 million tons of CO2 captured and stored would result in a credit of $425 million per year. And over the course of 12 years of eligibility, this could total up to $5.1 billion. For reference, the Air Products facility was estimated to cost $4.5 billion to construct when it was announced in 2021. While the 5 million tons of CO2 captured is substantial, it accounts for just 64% of the life cycle emissions from this project. The 2.8 million tons of CO2 equivalent emitted because of this project is about the same as the emissions from a natural gas-fired power plant. And it should be stressed that this is not an existing gray hydrogen project that's being retrofitted to be blue. This is new production that will bring new emissions. Next slide. So are we looking at even more money now? Carbon capture and storage is not cheap, and industry is already looking ahead, signaling that the credit of $85 per ton of stored CO2 will not be enough to make it financially viable. ExxonMobil's website advocates for an initial increase to about $100 per ton 45Q credit, along with additional favorable provisions. The National Petroleum Council, a body that advises the federal government on issues related to oil and gas policies, released a comprehensive report on carbon capture, utilization, and storage in 2019 that advised increasing the 45Q credit to $110 and eventually up to $150 per ton. And last year, an influential group of CCS proponents submitted a letter to Congress asking for changes to the 45Q that would raise the credit for CO2 used in enhanced oil recovery or other uses to the same level as that of permanent geologic storage, effectively increasing the credit from $65 to $85. Next slide. So using realistic assumptions for key life cycle analysis parameters, blue hydrogen is not clean or low carbon, and it should not be promoted as a clean fuel unless it meets the clean standard. Credits available under 45V do not provide a financial incentive to blue hydrogen producers to strive for those high rates of carbon capture. And 45Q credits represent a huge reservoir of funding for blue hydrogen that will cost taxpayers tens of billions of dollars while still contributing to global warming. Next slide. So I will pass it over to Tracy to talk about what is happening now in the Mach 2 Hydrogen Hub.
Thank you, Anika. So we have a slide here, and I'm going to give a brief update on the proposed Mach 2 Hydrogen Hub. For more information and details, and if you'd like to get involved in the campaign to stop Mach 2, there's a slide that we're going to show at the end of the presentation tonight with links and contact information. So Mach 2 targets the Delaware River watershed and communities throughout and beyond the watershed. It's not funded yet, and so it may not become a reality, but they are working towards getting approval for their funding. They've proposed about 20 sites in the state of Delaware, in South and Central New Jersey, and in Southeastern Pennsylvania. Now, they talk about this Mach 2 as being what they call green hydrogen. They claim that it's not going to use frack gas or natural gas, but we take issue with that. We don't have confidence that that is true, but also, if just looking at their documents, you can see they say that they will be producing hydrogen by using nuclear energy, renewable natural gas or biogas with carbon capture, refinery gray water, possibly methane and frack gas, hydropower, wind, and or solar. And the many projects that would make up the hub are discussed in the Mach 2 application that a link is being provided to in the chat. You can also get that on the Mach 2 website, which Anika has put into the chat as well. And now we have production, we have transport, and then we have end uses. And the transport of this production would go through a pipeline network. They are planning on a 50-mile major pipeline network that would go from Delaware City, Delaware, and that region to Philadelphia. It would also go across the river into the New Jersey side. Some of these pipelines would use existing pipeline infrastructure and easements. Some wouldn't. There are 6 shorter pipelines that are planned, some of them greenfields, some of them go right underneath houses, go right underneath the city of Philadelphia, for instance. They also plan to truck hydrogen and move that through trucking up the I-95 corridor and that network of roadways. They also mention railroads and ports. And I think it's important that we understand that reusing old pipelines and oil and gas infrastructure means that the communities that have been subject to pollution from fossil fuel industry over sometimes more than 100 years will continue to be burdened with the dangers and the pollution from Mach 2. And many of these communities are environmental justice communities. So then we have our end uses. Our production and storage sites. So that includes, and these are in that document that Anika has put in the chat, Philadelphia, Delaware City, Delaware, the Salem Oyster Creek site in New Jersey, Paulsboro and Gibbstown, New Jersey, Marcus Hook, and also the storage sites would be along the truck and rail transport routes and at terminals, and also at end-use locations such as SEPTA and Philadelphia, where they are already have purchased some hydrogen buses for public transport. There are maps in that Mach 2 document that we have the link to in the chat, but they show these planned projects, but they don't give a lot of information. But you can look at those maps and get a better picture for how this would affect perhaps your region. So we have end uses that are planned for Mach 2. We have power plants, heating, such as home heating, building heating, transportation, warehouse and terminal logistics. And actually the end uses are not very well sketched out. A lot of them have actually been put on hold for later stages, according to notes on the Mach 2 website. But I think the important thing here is to realize that the end uses Mach 2 plans include uses that will burn or combust hydrogen, and they require extensive transportation through our very densely populated region, exposing millions of people to these impacts. Nitrogen oxides, for instance, is emitted when hydrogen is burned, so it's released into the air, and that adds to our already NOx overloaded Delaware River Valley, increasing smog and ozone, and also increasing atmospheric warming. I think many of us know that the Delaware Valley does not meet federal clean air standards, doesn't even meet the minimum for ozone. So we can't really tolerate another molecule of NOx, but this would bring more NOx. Also, the hydrogen pollution that I just mentioned, in addition to NOx, is the PFAS, the forever chemicals that are a product when you make fuel cells, and also greenhouse gases. And this was already mentioned in terms of the blue hydrogen, but there are greenhouse gases related to green hydrogen, and all of this applies to green hydrogen, not just blue. But it's important because hydrogen is an indirect greenhouse gas that leaks profusely. So Mach 2 and the hydrogen hubs will actually make the climate crisis worse. And that's the opposite of what these hydrogen hubs and the initiative of the Biden administration is supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be addressing climate. This is not a climate solution. Green, blue, pink, orange, whatever you call it. So finally, I want to say that there's been a stark lack of community engagement as Mach 2 has developed. Mach 2 claims they will engage with communities, but it's clear from what we do know that it is too late to influence or change much of what Mach 2 plans to do. And you can't engage communities after the fact. That is what has been the problem, and it's been the standard operating procedure for industry forever, or no community consent or engagement at all. And it has led to the devastating conditions that overburdened communities experience every single day. It is intolerable, and we cannot allow it, and we won't allow that to be repeated here in the Delaware River Valley or within the Mach 2 footprint by Mach 2. So our position at Delaware Riverkeeper Network and the network of organizations that have formed to fight Mach 2 is that no matter what color your hydrogen is, what the source of energy is that you make hydrogen, we have to oppose Mach 2. And we will be working to stop it. And at the end, after the Q&A, we will have some links and information about how you can get involved. Before I turn it over to Anika and myself and Anika and David for the Q&A, I just want to say that we do have another webinar planned. We have one every month for those that have been attending. And the next one is on July 31st. It's called Nuke Powered Hydrogen. What are the impacts? But for now, let's go to our experts and see what questions we have in the Q&A. Anika, you want to start with what you found?
Yeah, so we'll just start with the basic one, which anyone can answer, but somebody just wanted a brief definition on what is the difference between blue and the difference between green hydrogen.
Blue hydrogen is made from methane, natural gas. Green hydrogen is made from renewable electricity, electrolysis, breaking up a water molecule into hydrogen and oxygen. That's the difference. The simple difference gets more complicated as you talk about how it's done and what the use is, how it's used.
David, could you also say what gray hydrogen is? Some people might not know that, and you and Anika mentioned it.
Gray hydrogen is hydrogen made from natural gas without any carbon capture. Black hydrogen, just to add it, throw another color in, is made from coal-fired power plants, without carbon capture.
So then building off of that, I think it's another one. So it's a question about green hydrogen. And the question is, in terms of what they plan to do with it, is it not a more complicated waste of energy and getting less energy if you are burning the electricity from the renewables in the making of hydrogen?
Anika, you want to answer it?
Sure. I think that's absolutely right. It's an enormously energy intensive process to make green hydrogen, and it's not there's efficiency. It's not a super efficient process, so energy is lost in the process. It takes energy to make this new source of energy or fuel that we would use for other purposes. So yes, it's much more cost effective and much more efficient to just use the renewables directly.
Awesome. And then so then I'm trying to build a whole thing here. So another one we have is when they talk about the standard for hydrogen emissions intensity, do they take into account that hydrogen is an indirect greenhouse gas?
No, that's a simple answer. Believe it or not, they do not consider the global warming impact of the product that they're making. By they, I mean the federal government's Department of Energy. It's mind-boggling, to use a technical term.
David, I have a question about that. So how do they get away with this, basic greenwashing? Because you end up with hydrogen that's an indirect greenhouse gas, and you undermine the goals of what this whole thing is supposed to be in terms of these hydrogen hubs.
The Congress mandated that the life cycle analysis end at the back gate of the hydrogen production facility. So the Department of Energy's answer is they're just doing what Congress mandated. Now, when they did a life cycle analysis for the Clean Air Act, that went from cradle to grave, from the production of whether it was coal or natural gas through the use of that fuel or whatever, the entire life cycle, which suggests the entire life. But Congress, in its infinite wisdom, decided that life cycle ends partway through the life.
And I just like to always give them and make sure there's nothing to add. So then would you say, we have a question, is hydrogen, even green hydrogen, the best way for the government to invest in addressing the climate crisis?
No. There are some, well, actually, yes and no. For most uses, the answer is no. For some uses, hydrogen will be needed. Hydrogen is used. And it may be cleaner to make green hydrogen use renewable energy to make green hydrogen than to continue to make hydrogen from using burning fossil fuels without any carbon capture. So
Yep.
yes, there are probably, well, no, there are some uses which you'll want fertilizer, for example, where we need hydrogen.
One thing I would just like to point out about Mach 2 is none of those, what they call hard to abate uses of hydrogen are in the Mach 2 hub. They're not replacing hydrogen now being used for fertilizer. They're not using it at steel plants. Those niche markets are really, at this point, as far as we're concerned, an intellectual discussion that the market could be dealing with. We don't need our government to be, spending the money on it at this point. And what we really should be doing is using renewables directly. I mean, even the Energy Information Administration of the federal government says it takes more energy to make hydrogen than it does, than you have useful energy at the end. And that's green hydrogen as well as blue. So green hydrogen is still an indirect greenhouse gas. It still pollutes when it's burned, and it's still not efficient. It's also very dangerous, and there's a lot of safety issues.
Yep.
So then I have a question for Anika. So Anika said that 45V is focused on the facility, but does carbon intensity account for upstream as well? An example being carbon intensity of the gas that might be supplied to the facility, and what else goes into carbon intensity?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you for giving me a chance to clarify that. So it is true that the carbon intensity calculations do include upstream emissions, like David was talking about, the methane emissions from actually drilling for the natural gas and transporting it to a facility, and leakages that occur en route, all of that. So all of that is part of the life cycle envelope that's included when we talk about the carbon intensity of hydrogen. So it comes from whatever your fuel source is, whether it's coal or natural gas. It's the production of that fuel, the delivery of that fuel to the facility, and then the production of the hydrogen at the facility. So yes, the upstream factors are included, but because 45V GREET in the calculation of the credit tiers, because they've fixed all of those values for all of the entities that will be applying for this credit, it effectively means that the only differences will be the plant level differences. So that was why, yeah, so it's not that those emissions are not included in the total number. It's just that it sort of levels, it kind of levels the playing field between producers in different parts of the country. And so you really just see those differences at plant level. Hopefully that addressed the question.
Awesome. And then I just want to make sure, because this might come up in other questions, and I'll apologize to anybody. There's more awesome questions coming in, so I'm trying to filter between new, and so if it seems it's a little erratic. What do we mean by indirect greenhouse gas?
What we mean is that hydrogen, depending on how much is in the atmosphere, it extends the lifetime of methane, and has a bigger, the higher the concentration of hydrogen, the bigger the impact from methane, because its lifetime is extended.
And I saw somewhere else on one of the questions, somebody was asking about a GWP for hydrogen. And if you, in the paper we put out last September, we have a chart and some source information for this, but the GWP that seems to be generally accepted is 33 for a 20-year horizon and 11 for a 100-year horizon.
And will all of these processes, are they going to be a self-monitoring process by the industry, or will there be another organization that's responsible for measuring these outputs?
That is a key question that we can't answer. we're afraid that what's going to happen is that companies will report on how much CO2 they capture, for example, as part of their tax filing, and that then, because it's a confidential filing, the public will not know how much CO2 is being captured by a facility. Perhaps, so it's very disconcerting, the question of who's going to monitor all of this process to determine whether in fact the companies deserve the 45V or 45Q credits that they're going to be getting. The tens of billions of dollars. The numbers are almost astronomical in terms of the credits that could potentially be given out for uses that will actually harm the environment and accelerate global warming.
And then I think a lot of what we're hearing out in the world then is that, hydrogen, we keep kind of hearing this phrase that hydrogen is the Swiss Army knife of clean energy solutions. And so I don't know if in either of your work or your conversations, if you've had any indication of why that is a concept and a term we keep hearing.
I'll take a shot at this. It's claimed that you can do all these things with hydrogen, okay? And this expert, Michael Liebrecht, developed the hydrogen ladder. He had, I think, it's 6 or 7 levels. The top ones were absolutely essential. You needed hydrogen. The bottom was, it was a disaster to use hydrogen. And what his explanation or criticism of the Swiss Army knife analogy is that sure, you can use a Swiss Army knife for lots and lots of things, but there are also some uses you wouldn't use it. Some of these uses, while you could use it, there are cheaper and better and more efficient ways of doing things. It's just hype. I mean, just really, it's hype.
Awesome. I didn't know, Anika, if you had anything to add. It looked like you were going to talk, so I wasn't sure.
I think the only thing I would add to that is that I think part of the hype around hydrogen is also related to this dream of reusing existing oil and gas infrastructure, and the idea that we can make hydrogen behave like these other hydrocarbons that we produce and transport that we're familiar with. And so there's sort of this idea of, oh, we'll produce this new thing and use all of this existing infrastructure and we'll make this change very quickly. So I think it's kind of tied up into that. And as the analogy that I like to, my favorite book title ever, because I'm a super geek, is from Mythbusters fame. So Adam wrote a book called Every Tool's a Hammer. So maybe it's a better analogy.
I love that.
I mean, it's also, if I could just add, it's that the whole plan for hydrogen is, it seems easy. It's a shining object that should be easy to implement. But what it really means is decades more of profitable operating life for the oil and gas industry, and continued greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere.
Awesome. So then we have a question too about carbon capture and sequestration, which is what is done with the captured carbon in the segment of the production process, and why is that being considered so important for these projects to be profitable?
Well, they get a higher subsidy under Section 45Q of the tax law if they permanently sequester the CO2 underground. Okay? Right now, the hydrogen production facilities in the world, none of them capture CO2. So we can't really talk about what do they do with it now. The plan is it will either be sequestered underground or else used for enhanced oil recovery. Now, what enhanced oil recovery means is you inject it underground and you produce oil that would not otherwise be producible. And then that oil is either used in a refinery or is burned. And what happens with either of those two uses? It produces more CO2. So really, you're going to capture CO2. The owner of the hydrogen production facility is going to get money from us, the 5 of us, and everybody who's still listening to the webinar. Through the federal government, they're going to get subsidies, and some of them are going to use the captured CO2 to produce more oil, which will produce more CO2 that will go in the atmosphere. It's absolutely insane. I guess, yeah, it's an insane idea that a subsidy is going to be given for enhanced oil recovery.
Mhm. And I just saw a question pop up in the chat that's related to that, David, and the question was whether or not the 45V calculation discriminates between permanent sequestration of this captured CO2 or used for EOR, and it does not. It assumes permanent sequestration.
So then, I guess with all of this too, this is sort of a question, sort of a statement, but you know, maybe you both have a reaction to it, that it sounds like this is a boondoggle for the petroleum industry. So I don't know if you have any reactions to maybe how this is being peddled as a clean energy solution, but like you said, it seems like there's a lot of fossil fuel company benefits that are really is what's happening in the background.
There are better alternatives to what the federal government has proposed for hydrogen. Alternatives that can be done faster and at lower cost. That's our conclusion. It's obvious to us. When we started looking at blue hydrogen a year and a half ago, Anika was sharper, and she caught on that this greed model was basically cooked. That it was, the assumptions were included in order to end up to a predetermined result. Now I'm normally cynical. That was a little too cynical to me at the beginning of our analysis, but she was absolutely right. The federal government has made assumptions that's going to transfer a lot of wealth from all of us as taxpayers to the oil and gas industry and the nuclear industry, and the coal industry probably get some as well. And I fear for what the result is going to look like in 20 or 30 years. Unless we abate greenhouse gas emissions as quickly as possible.
And then this question, I think this might be a good one to end, and Tracy, you might want to jump in on it as well. So the question is, where in the approval and development process can these approvals be challenged, and what governmental entities will be able to put this on hold or stop it?
Well, just overall for Mach 2 and the hydrogen hubs, it's really unclear how the whole thing is going to be regulated. We do know that state permits would be needed. They would probably need municipal approvals in some instances. They're going to need to go to some federal agencies. That they may have to go to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, for instance, or to the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration for pipelines and related infrastructure to pipelines. So we're not really sure, and it depends on what the production facility is, what the transportation facility is, and what the end use is. I think they will all be using and engaging different regulatory structures. However, we have questions into Mach 2 and the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, which is the arm of the Department of Energy that's overseeing the hydrogen hubs, asking that question. What agencies and what regulations are going to be applying? At this point, all we can guess is that it will be site-specific reviews by state and local, perhaps regional agencies, federal reviews where those are needed, and then there is supposed to also be, according to OCED, the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, a National Environmental Policy Act review, that's NEPA, and probably many of you are familiar with that. We're not sure how the NEPA process will actually apply. And frankly, I don't think they know exactly how the NEPA process is going to apply. It's another question we have into them to try to figure out, when are they going to apply NEPA? Are they truly going to be looking at all the cumulative impacts of the entire Mach 2 hub? That would be the way that you should do it if you're going to have an accurate assessment. We don't think that's the way they're thinking of it. We think they're probably looking at it in a way that reinforces the segmentation that has plagued NEPA for pipeline and terminal and refinery projects for years. So we don't know the full answer, and we're trying to find that information out.
Yeah, I think Tracy hit on a key point. I don't think anyone knows how this process is going to work out. I think that an important segment to for folks to focus on are investors. I'm sure they're sitting there looking at all these billions of dollars thinking, wow, this is a good deal with little risk. And they couldn't be more wrong. There is a lot of risk for investors in this project, in this whole plan. And if we got back together again here in 5 years, everybody, not us, but everybody involved in this, from producers to users will be suing each other. This is going to be permanent employment for lawyers. I mean, where are they going to put the pipelines? The hydrogen and CO2 pipelines? Are communities going to want them running through their backyards? My guess is no. And they're talking about 20,000 miles of that's an estimate, of just new CO2 pipelines. That doesn't include new hydrogen pipelines. Yeah, the way this is going to turn out is unknown. I wouldn't feel despair that all of these facilities are going to show up in my community next week or in 2 years. Pressure on Congress. Get the truth to investors. And if necessary, go to court. That's my strategy.
Well, we also add in there public opposition. So we'll be talking about that when we close up.
I meant that to be that's underlying all the 3 things I mentioned.
Right.
The more that the federal government identifies the specific facilities that are going to get money, the more individual communities will know that they are going to be impacted and not in a good way. That's why the federal government's not letting out any information. They don't want opposition to their hub plans around the country, because they know that when you folks and the folks in the Ohio River Valley and in Texas, Louisiana, and in the Northwest and in California know what's coming, they're not going to be happy. Maybe some will, but a lot won't.
Well, I think this is a good segue. I think we're at 7:28. Unless we have any other questions, we'll try to answer ones that weren't answered perhaps after. But I think at this point, if we could just turn a little bit to our closing slide, we can, what we'd like to share with everybody is that it's really important for us all to be communicating and to organize together in order to stop Mach 2. And we already have a network that has formed. We meet regularly. We've already had actions, public actions, and we will continue to have those. So if you want to get involved, there's two email addresses up there for you. And we do have a network that that you can join. You can do that as an individual as well by taking action right now on the petition that you see at the top. I think Anika also put that into the chat. And we will be sending out a copy of the recording of this webinar with an email. And in that, we'll put a bunch of other links for information on how to get involved. We're developing a website. We have, committees that meet. So we're very active in opposing this. So our coalition of groups is very engaged. And I want to say that we believe we can stop Mach 2. Mach 2 has not received its funding yet, and they have been bumbling everything. They've been bumbling the public, what they're supposed to have this public engagement. They've been bumbling that. They've made one mistake after another. And we believe that we can show the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations that they don't deserve to get the funding because they've botched the most important thing they were supposed to do, the priority thing they were supposed to do during this period, which is engage communities, and they haven't done it. But for other reasons as well, all of the reasons that we've talked about here tonight, in terms of why hydrogen is hyped, why it doesn't work, and why we need to stop this outrageous amount of money that's being thrown. I think David has used the figure of up to $100 billion in the end once all these different credit programs and grants get doled out. And that's just outrageous. Just think what we could do if we were investing that in renewables and then directly using that electricity. It's really a scandal. And we believe that if we can stop Mach 2, it will help. We are communicating and working with other hubs across the nation, and people are mobilizing. So we believe that this can be stopped. And we don't feel, we feel buoyed by so many people being interested in this. Main thing that we want to continue to do with these webinars, though, is to educate, because people just don't know anything about this. And, really have to say thank you, everybody, for coming out, because, then you talk to other people, and we're available. Our network is available to come and speak. We do Zoom talks and that kind of thing all the time. But I also want to say tonight that our next webinar again is nuke-powered hydrogen. What are the impacts? They call that pink hydrogen, by the way. Hate those terms, but that will be on July 31st at 6:30 p.m. But if you go to our webpage, you will see there's information, and we put it up there as we get more information. And our exchange of information amongst our network will be on a dedicated website that's being developed now. So thank you all very much. I want to give a special thank you to Anika Juhn and to David Schlissel. You are just stellar experts. You guys have really done a great job tonight in helping us all understand what are the financial implications, and just what does this mean in terms of the climate crisis. We're all facing an emergency, and they're acting like, oh, we're going to dole this out over, by the way, they say it's going to take 10, 20 years to make this hydrogen hub. Way too slow anyway. If they had a good solution, they should be doing it right away, because we need to reduce our greenhouse gases by at least 52% by 2030, and that's only 6 friggin' years from now. So thank you, Anika Juhn. Thank you, David Schlissel. We greatly appreciate your expertise and you sharing so generously your time and your thoughts with us this evening.
Keep up the good fight.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Good night.
everybody.